ladies and gentlemen, Arjun Chowdhury.
Good evening. Thanks to Janice for inviting me. I'm particularly excited to speak before this movie because I actually show clips from Sebastian Junger's other movies, Restrepo and Koringal, in my classes. Speaking of my, sorry. So it's a real privilege to introduce this movie. So in my comments today, I'd just like to give you some context about civil wars in general. So we'll just start with a question: how unique is Syria's civil war? So if you just think on two dimensions which are most obviously in the news, Syria's civil war seems to be actually quite different, quite unique. Those two dimensions are quite simply just the power and weapons of the Assad regime. Usually in civil wars, the reason for fighting is that the central government the rebels are fighting is pretty weak. Assad's regime, at the very least, has a huge amount of destructive capacity. Think of the barrel bombs, the chemical weapons, the air power. So the Assad regime is unusual in these civil wars as having a fair amount of destructive capacity. So that's probably one way in which Syria's civil war is unique, and you'll see some of that in this movie. The second way in which it's different, but not unique, as I'll say in a moment, is that the role of foreign powers in Syria has been quite extensive. And arguably, the involvement of Russia and Iran have saved the Assad regime from collapse a few years ago in the fighting. So while foreign involvement is actually quite common in civil wars, you can think, for example, now of Saudi Arabia and Yemen. You can think of Cuba and Angola in the past, so on and so forth. The extent of it in Syria is actually quite unusual. And certainly the fact that these interventions are changing the outcomes is also quite unusual. Now, having said that, let me actually tell you that from most of what we know, Syria's civil war is actually quite like most other civil wars. And to start with, let me just start with the basic fact that I'd probably like you to remember, is just how long this war has gone on. In a few months, this war will be going into its 7th year. And this is sadly typical of civil wars. Between 1945 and 2004, there were 128 civil wars starting, at a rate of a little more than 2 a year. Of these, 50% last 7 years or more, 50%. And a quarter last more than 12 years. Right? So let me give you the contrast, which is interstate wars, wars between states. 50% of these last 4 months or less. So interstate wars are actually quite short when they happen. Civil wars are very, very long, 7 years or more, 50% of the time. Now, you're probably thinking, we have other striking numbers from Syria, numbers about the human cost of this war. Obviously, 500,000 dead, 5 million refugees, and so on. So why is this guy emphasizing this dry, lame number like the duration of the war? So let me tell you why. The main reason is that when a war lasts 7 years or more, two really bad things happen, and some of which I think you'll see in this movie. The first of these really bad things is that when you fight for a long time, basic maintenance of infrastructure just stops. It's not just that the infrastructure is getting broken by bombings and so on. It is also that if there's a pothole in the road, no one will fix it. And 4 types of infrastructure get really badly degraded. Those 4 are health infrastructure, the clinics don't work, immunization stop, education, schools shut down, roads, and electric. Now, what this means is that if you think about children not getting immunizations for 3, 4, 5, 6 years, they are going to be sick very frequently, even after the war is over. So that's a huge problem. This breaking of infrastructure over a long period of time means that you might stop the war, but people are still going to be sick. People are still going to die much younger than they would have if the war had either not started, ideally, or had been shorter. So that's the first problem, the breaking of infrastructure and obviously the long-run effects. The second problem that happens when a war lasts a long time is that as people fight, they grow distrustful of each other. And this means that even after the war is over, these people will be living in the same places. They'll find it really hard to cooperate and coexist for many years in future. We used to think that civil wars were about ethnic hatreds or religious hatreds that preceded the war, happened before the war and thus led to the war. What we actually find is that most of the time that's not the case. What we find is that most of the time, people weren't really that motivated by racial or ethnic hatred. But what happens is that once the war starts, their behavior changes. That is, they are often forced to hurt or wound or kill their neighbors, and that's where the distrust starts. So if you look at Rwanda, for example, when you look at Rwanda, you think, oh, Hutus and Tutsis always hated each other. This was not actually true, we find now. We find that prior to 1994, Hutu and Tutsi, yeah, there were struggles, but they often intermarried, they lived together, they did business with each other. So what happened? After 1994, a lot of Hutus were forced to choose. They were forced to kill their neighbors, hurt their family members, and this has now led to huge amounts of distrust in that society. The society is polarized between Hutu and Tutsi. So now, actually, they are much more distrustful than they were before 1994 when the genocide happened. Right? The lesson here is that long wars hurt a society long after the fighting is over. So you're probably thinking, why is this then? Why do civil wars last so long? So we are not 100% sure. This is in the last decade or so, this has been the big thing that we've tried to understand. Why are civil wars so long? Why do peace deals break down, so on and so forth? And we find that the most likely reason is that during the conflict, the fighting factions are worried that the other side is going to break any deal that happens. So they either don't sign a deal or they break the deal themselves. You can see this, for example, in Syria, where 2 peace deals in 2016 alone were signed and then broken. So clearly there's something going on where there's a distrust that in future, one side or the other are going to break the agreement and fight. And this becomes particularly dangerous because one of the problems in civil wars where you don't have uniforms, which I think also you'll see in this movie, is that you might think that in this moment that the other side has 100 soldiers or 1,000 soldiers. But that could change in 2 weeks' time. That could change in a month's time. So any deal you sign now can be void if your enemy's strength grows in 2 weeks or a month. Because recruitment in civil wars is not like a standing army that you can predict all the way through. It ebbs and flows. And so there's huge uncertainty about how strong the other guy is. And if you think he's going to be stronger in future, you don't sign a deal. You keep fighting. And these wars just don't stop. There's a scholar, Anne Hironaka, who was at the University of Minnesota while I was there. She called the modern civil war a never-ending war. And that's basically what we're dealing with right now. So I'll finish. What I'm saying is that when you watch this movie and when you think about civil wars, these problems that Janice brought up, I would suggest to you from the research we have, the single most important thing to keep in mind is actually this lame, boring, mundane number, which is how long the war lasts. What we know is that civil wars are long, and the longer they are, the worse things get. So the really wicked foreign policy problem of the present and for the future is how do we bring these wars to a quick end? That is, how do we promote either peace deals, negotiated settlements that work, or military victories that will stop the wars before they get into years 4, 5, 6, or in this case, worse. So on that note, I'll stop. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the movie. Thanks a lot.